Welcome to Section 4 of Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High. In this lesson, we'll hear again from Joseph Grenny. In the last lesson, we learned what to do when others are feeling unsafe during a crucial conversation. We learned that when others are moving to silence or violence, we can rebuild safety to bring them back to dialogue. But what about when we ourselves are moving to silence or violence? What can we do when our own emotions are moving us away from dialogue? That's what Joseph will teach in this next lesson entitled, Master My Stories.
Let's dive right in. Rather than just talk about emotions, let's create some. I'd like for you to listen to your boss. You're going to listen to John. He's going to come at you pretty strong, and I want you to just pay attention to how you feel toward John at the end of this.
Hey, listen, I don't care what they taught you at your last job. Now you work for me, and I would not be made a fool in front of anyone just because I don't have a clue as to what you're doing. Are you hearing me? As far as I'm concerned, your number one job is to keep me informed of every step you take. And from this moment on, if you so much as break a fingernail, I want to hear about it. Have I made myself clear?
Okay, how about it? How are you feeling towards John? How would you describe him to a close friend of yours? What emotions are you feeling toward him? How will they affect your behavior toward John? What are you going to do? You're going to give him feedback? You're going to go to silence? You're going to go to violence? We talked about crucial conversations as being those where the stakes are high, opinions are opposing one another, and emotions are really strong. We wanted you to feel some emotions right now so that what we'll cover next is more than just an intellectual exercise. Earlier we said that the dialogue smart have rare behavioral agility. Remember the executive, Greta, that I described earlier, who was accused in front of 200 of her managers of raging hypocrisy? I described how in that instant she was able to catch herself, and rather than launching an attack or going for revenge, she actually ended up feeling appreciative. She ended up grateful to the person who asked that question for giving her an opportunity to influence how 200 senior managers saw the cost-cutting initiative. Now, let's go back to that moment and ask, what was going on in her head in the half-second between when she felt like moving to violence and when she said, "I'm glad you asked that question"? The answer is that the best attain behavioral agility because they develop great emotional agility. They have a way of working with their own emotions that makes it possible for them to get to dialogue even and especially when conversations are risky or threatening. Over the years, we've noticed 3 common responses to strong emotions, like the ones you felt when John railed on you. In those circumstances, the worst act them out and then pay a price for doing it. The good try to suppress them and eventually fail. The best don't act them out, they think them out. In this lesson, we'll learn 3 powerful skills the dialogue smart use to think out rather than act out their emotions. As with other skills we've covered, we hope these 3 skills will sound kind of familiar to you. In fact, they'll help you understand how you do so well already in some very challenging situations. By calling attention to them and making them conscious, you'll increase your ability to draw on them more consistently during crucial conversations. Horace Walpole said, "Life is a comedy for those who think and a tragedy for those who feel." The dialogue smart have tools for thinking about what they feel, for literally shaping their own emotions. In the face of strong emotions, most of us close our third eye. We stop paying attention to signs of deteriorating safety. We give in to our style under stress. The dialogue smart, on the other hand, open it wider. They are more mindful of safety. They resist their style under stress, and, most importantly, they move into their own heads to influence their emotions. They begin to think about what they feel. You see, you have only 2 choices in dealing with strong emotions. You can either act on them or be acted on by them. In a moment, we'll revisit what to do with John. For now, let's just agree that silence and violence are suckers' choices. We can walk away, say nothing, resent him, quit, or in other ways become an accomplice with him in continuing behavior like that. When we go to silence, we literally become an accomplice, because by our behavior, we act in a way to perpetuate the way he's behaving. We become an accomplice in supporting him and continuing the very thing that we don't like. On the other hand, we can move to violence. We can aggressively confront him, file a grievance, or in other ways pay him back. In doing so, we move from resenting him to resembling him. We violate safety, we abandon dialogue without even having tried it. Let's look for a third alternative. Rather than succumbing to these emotions, let's see if there's a way of acting on them that could lead us to better results. Let's start by asking where emotions come from. I want to tell you about a gentleman that I had a chance to work with a few years ago. He was a manager from a telecommunications company by the name of Lee. He had a reputation amongst his direct reports, kind of like how you probably see John right now. We heard that one day he walked into a communications center and saw an alarm unplugged. He freaked out. He ran over, grabbed a technician, towed him by the arm, pointed at it, and screamed an inch from his face, spit flying on this guy, saying, "What in the heck were you thinking?" There was no pause for an answer. It was more of a rhetorical question. And he says, "Now you get a crew down here, reattach that alarm, then collect your personal items and get out of here." Fired him on the spot. Well, this was a represented employee, so firing him on the spot didn't quite work. He ended up with a grievance, and that wasn't the worst of it. He had a reputation for these kinds of outbursts on a regular basis, even around things as petty as finances, reimbursements for $20 lunches where the IRS doesn't even require a receipt. He demanded to have a 50-cent cup of coffee documented before he would reimburse. As we worked to try to create a coaching relationship with Lee and documented some of these instances and concerns amongst his direct reports and others in his organizations, we heard many stories like these. Okay, let's take Lee's example and answer our question, where do emotions come from? I'd like to introduce a model to you. Try to envision an arrow moving from the left to the right in your mind. The arrow point is on the right. We'll call this arrow the path to action. We call it that because it starts with action, with something happening, and it ends with action, with you doing something in response to what happened. At the far left of the arrow, we have two terms, see and hear. That's where the path to action starts. It starts with you seeing or hearing or experiencing something. Somebody behaves, somebody acts, and you see it, hear it, or in other ways experience it. Let's take Lee's example. He walks into a facility and sees a disconnected alarm. He remembers previous experiences where policies were not obeyed. For instance, in disconnecting an alarm or in other ways violating a policy. That's the first step on the path to action, seeing and hearing. The second step is we tell a story. We can't have an emotion until we tell a story about it. Seeing and hearing something creates no feelings or sentiments inside of us. Now, the story we tell does three things. It brings our judgments, our conclusions, and our attributions to bear. In essence, it assigns meaning to what happens. There are an infinite number of stories we could tell about an alarm being disconnected. Let's play with it for a minute. Why would somebody disconnect an alarm? Well, I could tell a story that says they're busy people and the alarm was malfunctioning and they haven't had a chance to repair it yet. See how that story would move me? I could tell another story, a little bit more like Lee actually did, that says these folks don't care about policies, they're violating them, they don't care about quality, they don't care about the customers, you see the emotions I start to create with that kind of a story. In fact, it could get even more personal. They're specifically disobeying my orders. They're violating what I've asked them to do. Now I can whip myself up into a rage. But catch the issue here. The original experience, what I see and hear, are objective facts. It isn't until I move to step 2 on the path to action, where I tell a story, that I begin to assign meaning to it, that I begin to draw conclusions, that I begin to make judgments about what's good or bad, that I begin to attribute motive to what people have done. So picture again this arrow. First, we have an experience. We see or hear or otherwise experience something. Secondly, we tell a story. I think you get now where the third step is going. We feel something. We have emotions about what we originally experienced, but not until we tell a story. There are an infinite number of stories we could tell about any set of facts. Think about that for a moment. There's an important principle in this. There are an infinite number of stories that we could tell about any set of facts. You heard Ron in one of the previous tapes talking about one of the dialogue principles. I want to share a personal little story about one of his daughters, Amber. Amber was invited one year to attend the Junior Olympics. She had competed for only 1 year in track and the high jump, and she was thrilled to be able to go participate. After the event, she was riding the plane home when she was approached by a flight attendant who noticed that she had a T-shirt on that said Junior Olympics. The flight attendant, making polite conversation, said, "Well, how did you do?" She said, "I came in 14th. Of course, the next question was, "How many in your field?" 14. The question is, how did Amber feel? Where was she on the third step of the path to action? She had an experience, came in 14th out of 14. How is she feeling about that experience? Of course, the answer to that is it depends on the story she's telling. Well, she could tell herself a story that says, "I came in 14th out of 14. I'm humiliated. I've got to go home in defeat." And she would create an emotion called depression or sadness, a sense of failure. She could be telling herself, "I came in 14th out of 100,000. There are 100,000 high jumpers in the United States, and I am the 14th best in the United States," in which case she could feel some pride, some satisfaction. Another important point of this is the first year Amber had competed. She could feel pretty good about even having come in last in the Junior Olympics. She could feel a sense of challenge. Yes, I know now what I can do better. I know what I failed at. I saw what people did who beat me in this competition. And next year. You get the range of emotions, anywhere from a sense of challenge to a sense of defeat to a sense of exhilaration and pride. Any of those emotions are available to her based on the same exact experience, depending on what? On the story she tells her. So let's go back to Lee. Lee walks in and he sees an alarm disconnected. Something you need to understand about Lee is that he is a quality zealot. As I got to know him a little bit better, I realized this is somebody who is 100% committed to things being done right, to the customer being served, to telecom being maintained in a reliable way. He felt a sense of obligation and responsibility, of duty to the company as well. This was an integrity issue for Lee. And when he saw things like disconnected alarms, he saw a violation of integrity. That was the story he told. Do you understand his emotions now? I asked him, what if I could tell you how to get people to really support safety and quality, to really get them to buy in at the same visceral level that you do? Lee was intrigued. The first question he asked was, "What do you mean, this deadbeat lot?" And I said, "Yeah, that deadbeat lot. What if we could get those exact same people to have the same passion for safety and quality that you do?" Well, now he was really hooked. My challenge then was to influence Lee's story. If you want to get at the behavior, change the story. If you want to get at the emotions, change the story. So let's look at the whole path to actions. It starts with seeing and hearing. Second, we tell a story. Next, we feel. And finally, we act. Like it or not, our actions are influenced by our feelings or emotions. If we want to change our actions, we had darn well better influence our emotions. If we want to influence our emotions, we're going to have to deal with our stories. As we worked with Lee, he began to see his staff as full of all kinds of people, many with a commitment to safety and quality, but caught with competing goals. One thing he wasn't aware of was that an alarm had been going off intermittently for months. In the same facility, they had computer readouts that triggered real emergencies. The clapper alarm was a holdover from the 1950s and was frankly irrelevant. Why was it important for him to understand that the alarm wasn't quite what it appeared to be? Well, as we worked with Lee and helped him become conscious of his story, as we helped him to see the connection between his story, his emotions, and his actions, he began to realize that the way he told this story was a pivotal issue in whether or not he got the results he really wanted from his team. So challenging this issue of the alarm helped him to realize that he had actually begun looking for evidence to confirm his belief that everybody out there was a bunch of ne'er-do-wells that didn't care about quality. As he realized that some of these data points weren't quite what he had made them out to be, his story softened, his feelings softened. and his behavior changed accordingly. So here's what we've got so far. Any set of facts could be used to tell an infinite number of stories. At any point in time, there are a variety of emotions we could feel. My wife approached me early in our marriage. I was traveling a great deal, and she had some frustration around it. She had an increased responsibility in taking care of our children as a result of my greater travel burden. She sat down with me one weekend after I'd noticed some signs for some period of time that she was probably frustrated and disappointed, and she opened our conversation with this statement. She said, "I'm not very happy in our marriage." There are a lot of emotions I could have felt. Now, I don't claim any special maturity for having felt the one I did. It just so happened that the story I told myself was, thank goodness she's putting this on the table and we can do something about it. At any point in time, there are a variety of emotions we could feel. The ones I felt in that instance led us to an extremely productive dialogue about a crucial conversation that improved the quality of our marriage. If I told a different story, I could have had different feelings, and we could have gone to silence or violence and experienced significant damage to our marriage. The question for us to ask ourselves when we're facing difficult and challenging emotions about high-stakes issues is, which emotions will lead to the results we really want? Okay, so the first principle of mastering our stories, of influencing our own emotions, is that our emotions come from our stories, not from the facts, not from our initial experience. When we say something like, "You make me mad," or "I'm getting so frustrated here because of X, Y, or Z," we're actually saying something that's not quite true. Those experiences, those events do not create our emotions. Otherwise, why would 10 people who have the same experience have entirely different emotions? The reason? Because they tell different stories. The skill then, the first skill for mastering my stories, is to separate fact and story. We walk back down the path to action that we sprinted forward on before. This process of the path to action happens so quickly. We have an experience, we quickly tell a story, aren't even aware sometimes that we're telling the story, and all of a sudden have a feeling. It happens so quickly that it's easy for us to really believe that the experience created the feeling. We miss the entire step of the story. This skill of separating fact and story is to go back slowly and ask, what story am I telling, and what facts do I really have to support it? When we do that, we begin to realize how frequently we suffer from selective perception. In other words, we begin to look for things in our environment that support our story and ignore everything that would challenge it. Here's a nice little visual example of it. If you're not driving right now, at least, take a look around really quickly. Look around your environment. Look in the car. Look at your clothes. Look at the trees or the traffic outside, signs that you're passing by, and try to notice everything that is red. Look for red. See the red in the signs, the red in the cars, the red on the people, the red in your car, anything you can see that's red. Take a look. Look around quickly. Now, again, if you're not driving, close your eyes. You ready? Now I want you to try, without opening your eyes, to remember everything you saw that was brown. Kind of hard, isn't it? Something interesting about perception is that we're constantly filtering it. There's so much data in our environment that we need a filter. Our stories become our filters. Our stories cause us to select certain things and ignore many, many others, just like Lee. He began looking for things like disconnected alarms, which if he had a different story would have been entirely irrelevant. We begin instead to look for data that would, even if we have to twist it a bit, support the story that we're carrying around and reinforce the emotions that we're feeling. Thus, the first principle for influencing our emotions is to stop that process, to separate fact from story and look at them starkly and objectively. Before we can separate fact from story, we need to be clear on which is what. Facts are things we experience by seeing or hearing, direct experience. Facts are verifiable data that most people would readily agree on. Facts can be behaviors, for instance. You walked in the door at 9:15 a.m. Most people would readily agree, if they observed it simultaneously, that that was a fact. Stories, on the other hand, are conclusions we draw by combining facts. For example, you're perpetually late. I take the fact that you walked in at 9:15 and facts that I've accumulated from other experiences, and I draw a conclusion. I tell a story that you are perpetually late. Stories can also be judgments we make about the facts. These are things that tell us if the facts are good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral. So I might say, you arrived late for our meeting to demonstrate your importance. It's a judgment that I make about you. That can become part of a story. Judgments are similar to another thing that we do in stories, attributions. We attribute motives and cause. We say, this is the reason for something. This is the motive that you had when you did what you did. So it's critical for us, before we can separate facts from stories, to understand the difference between the two. Now, having an intellectual difference makes it sound easy. It's actually quite a bit harder than it sounds. Think, for example, of someone who's irritated you recently, someone who really got on your nerves. Got a name? Got an experience? Okay, good. How would you describe this person? Think about some of the words, the adjectives, the way you would talk about this person to another individual that you felt safe describing him with. Now, think about how you went about that description. Most of it, if you're like most people, is story, very little fact. We'll say things like, they're perpetually late with assignments. That's our story. It sounds like fact, but in fact, these are conclusions from combining other experiences. The facts are the original concrete experiences that created the stories, or rather, that fed them and gave us the opportunity to create them. So, now take this individual who irritated you and describe carefully the behaviors, the experiences, or verifiable information you have, not your judgments or conclusions. Pause the tape and give this a shot. And try to catch yourself when you use words that sound more like value judgments or conclusions than like facts. How'd you do? Did you give it a shot? If you did, and if you're like most people, you found it pretty tough to get back to the actual events, the verifiable data that supported your story. Maybe you've had experiences like I have with people that say, here's some feedback for you. For example, you're unreliable. No, not that anybody would say that to me. But then you say, well, I'm not sure what you mean by that. Can you give me an example of it? And they say, have you heard it before? Well, I can't think of one offhand, but when I see it next time, I'll let you know. We tend to be fairly pitiful at remembering the hard facts, the data, the experiences that support our stories. We have the experience, we tell a story, then we forget the experience and just carry the story around. This makes it all the more difficult for us to challenge and change our stories. That's why this skill, separating facts from stories, is so doggone important, particularly when we're dealing with crucial conversations. I had an experience once that brought home to me how when we're not careful to separate our facts from our stories, we begin to twist the facts to support and reinforce the story that we're telling. It's a really natural process. Was riding the elevator with a lady who worked in a financial services company that we were consulting with at the time. They had just handed out really fancy coffee mugs to highlight the new strategy the company was working to implement. I looked at her coffee cup and, just to make conversation, said, what do you think of the new coffee cups? And she said, they must be planning a layoff. Now, I thought maybe it was my accent that got her to that response. But I asked her again, what do you mean? I was talking about the coffee cup, and she said, well, they must be planning a layoff. I said, I'm not sure how you get there from the coffee cup. She said, well, this coffee cup is much smaller than the last ones they gave us. See where she's going with this? If they're so concerned about scrimping on a few pennies worth of coffee, they're probably so paranoid about costs that they're going to start lopping off heads soon. See what she did there? Kind of an interesting little trick. She was so convinced that the story of this company being either weak financially or cost-conscious, not caring about employees, that she carried that story around and looked even in a brand new, fairly expensive, attractive coffee cup for evidence to support the story. I worked with a group of physicians fairly recently. where the hospital they worked in had recently changed the lunch menu. Instead of the sandwiches they usually had laid out, they put a deli plate. Two of the doctors cornered me and said, "There they go again. They have absolutely no respect for us." I was curious about why, and they shared with me the evidence. The evidence was the change of the menu. They were now giving out cheaper lunches, which was evidence the hospital didn't support them. Now, what other stories could they have told? An infinite variety. Aren't we glad the hospital is saving on irrelevant or small things? We could be going and buying sandwiches ourselves. The corporation focuses most of its discretionary capital and monies into important investments that affect patient welfare and well-being. Could have told many stories similar to that, but this is the one they chose to tell. That created certain emotions, that drove certain behaviors. Very few of them looked like dialogue. This is why it is so critical to learn to see our own story, to separate it from the facts. We must become conscious of it, then play with it, push on it, ask questions of it, press it for facts. Ask for facts that conflict with our story. You see, at first, we control the story. But later, the story controls us. It determines what we will see and not see. We have to actually strain to see things that challenge it, and that's precisely what the dialogue smart do. We have to learn to stand apart from our story in order to gain emotional control. We become actors on, rather than victims of, our emotions. I think one of the best expressions of this idea was made by Salman Rushdie, of all people. He said, "Those who do not have power over the story that dominates their lives, power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change it as times change, truly are powerless because they cannot think new thoughts." I would add to that, they cannot feel new feelings, and they cannot take healthier actions. So in the spirit of Joe Friday from the old Dragnet show, just the facts, ma'am. Let's practice here for a minute. We're going to practice separating fact from story. We're going to use, for our example, a story that you're carrying around. Remember John. Remember your story about him? How you describe him in your head, how you feel toward him? Well, what are the facts? Think about it for a minute. If you're like most people, it's probably kind of tough. You remember how you feel about him, you remember how you would describe him, but specific behaviors, specific words that you heard or a tone of voice, those are a little tough to dredge back up to support the story. So we're going to make it a little easier for you. Let's listen to him again, and this time try to separate the facts, what he's really doing objectively, from your feelings or conclusions or judgments about what he's doing from your story.
Hey, listen, I don't care what they taught you at your last job. Now you work for me, and I would not be made a fool in front of anyone just because I don't have a clue as to what you're doing. Are you hearing me? As far as I'm concerned, your number one job is to keep me informed of every step you take. And from this moment on, if you so much as break a fingernail, I want to hear about it. Have I made myself clear?
Okay, so what's your story first about John? He's a control freak, a jerk. He's doing this because he gets some cheap thrill out of it. Who knows? You've got a story. What are the facts? Well, some might be he raised his voice. He used commanding phrases like, "Do you hear me?" or "If you so much as break a fingernail." You could also say, if you had seen him, that he was pointing his finger at me or shaking his pencil at me. All of those are objective facts. You combine those facts into a story, and the story is control freak, jerk, cheap thrill, or what have you. But are there other stories that those same facts would support? If we were trying to be really careful here, and we watched somebody talk to us in the way that John just did, what other stories could we tell? Do we say, for instance, maybe he's running scared? Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe we let him down. Maybe he believes that we don't care about his interests or his goals. Is it possible that that's part of the story about John? If I told those stories, what would happen to my emotions? Would it be a little easier, perhaps, to get to dialogue with John? So what's the use of all of this? Well, let me tell you what the use is not. What we are not trying to do here is absolve John of responsibility for behaving respectfully toward us. That's not what we're trying to do at all. This is not about sit in a room and make yourself feel good. This is about influencing our emotions so that we can get to a healthy dialogue with John. So, if our story now is, he's under a lot of pressure, or he's been embarrassed and he's handling it poorly, or he thinks I won't care and won't respond if he doesn't yell at me, what emotions will that bring to me? Well, for me personally, it would probably cause me to feel a little bit more understanding toward him. Still frustrated with the way he treated me, but understanding at least because I've probably behaved similarly in similar circumstances. Will it now be any easier to get to dialogue? Could I possibly build enough safety to give him feedback? Could I find a mutual purpose for doing so? If the answer to some of those is yes or maybe, then we're making progress. You see, once you separate the facts from the story, you are no longer controlled by one story, and you can choose to author a new one that creates more helpful feelings and promotes dialogue rather than silence or violence. So we're making progress. Let's add one more dimension.